All right. I am so thrilled to see such a wonderful turnout for today's webinar. My name is Bernadette Austin. I'm the Chief Executive Officer here at CivicWell. We're an organization that was founded over 40 years ago as local government commission, and we're really thrilled to have you join us for our webinar series. So this fall webinar series is an opportunity for us to discuss cross-sector and holistic approaches to the various challenges that we face. Today, I'm really proud to bring you insights from some of my favorite friends and colleagues who are really working as change makers at the intersection of fields like climate, health, transportation, and community investment. I'll ask my colleague to drop the link in chat. Many of you have probably joined us for some of the other events in this series. We have one more, which is going to be in November. That's going to be on November 13th. We're going to hear about how um, cohesive funding strategies from state, federal, and philanthropic sources can amplify the work of local communities and community-based organizations. So we'll drop that link into the chat as well. I want to take a moment to thank our webinar series sponsor, AARP California. They are deeply committed to efforts that improve livability across our great state. So thank you all for joining us. I'd like you to take a moment and introduce yourselves in chat if you'd like to. If you wanted to share your name and any organization affiliations, it could be your day job, and also if you're part of any coalitions, appointments, etc. So welcome. Today we're going to hear from our esteemed speakers about a very scary topic on Halloween, which of course are climate disasters. So first we're going to be hearing folks in the order that I'm going to introduce them in, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, you can look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the Q&A function, and you can put your question in there. You can also use the chat. And depending on if there is time available, you can use a raise hand function. Because there are a large number of attendees, I really encourage you to try and put your question in writing. We'll collect all those questions, and at the end of the presentations, we'll have an opportunity for our speakers to respond. So we're first going to be hearing from Jeff Ross. He serves as a director of federal and state programs at HORNE. He has assisted federal agencies, states, and local and foreign governments in the design and implementation of their programs. He has worked at all levels of government, including at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, within the state legislature, as well as being an appointee by the governor. Next, we'll be hearing from Lisa Craig, who is the mayor of the city of Lodi, where she prioritizes policy efforts in the areas of economic development, downtown revitalization, multimodal transportation, and clean energy production. She is also the president of the Craig Group Partners LLC, which is a national consulting firm facilitating local governments and nonprofit organizations in planning for climate resilience and economic vitality in historic communities. After that, we'll be hearing from Kirin Kumar, who serves as the Northern California Grantmakers Director of Climate and Disaster Resilience. Previously, he was Deputy Director of Equity and Government Transformation at the California Strategic Growth Council. As a state grant maker, he oversaw $25 million in upstream portfolio, including movement building organizations, tribes, local governments, and coalitions of multi-sector partners to shift power and increase regional capacity to advance climate justice. And last but certainly not least, we'll be hearing from Sarah Atkinson. She's a hazard resilience senior policy manager at SPUR, which is a nonprofit public policy organization serving the Bay Area. She leads work on hazard mitigation, climate adaptation, community resilience, and environmental justice. She has worked in green construction, food access and education, and environmental communications. So you can learn more and get the full bios of our speakers at the link that we'll be providing in the chat. And with that, I just want to give one more reminder. Please introduce yourself in chat. We would love to know who's in the room, so your name and any affiliations. Also, we encourage you to use the chat and Q&A functions for any questions that you might have, which we will take after all of the speakers have done their presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Jeff Ross.
Happy Halloween, everyone. I'm going to do the scary thing of trying not to mess up my technical stuff here. So hopefully you all see my screen and that I'm sharing appropriately.
Looks
With that,
great.
wonderful. With that, I'm really excited to continue our conversation that we started earlier this year at the policy conference, and really kind of drive home the importance of relationship building when we're thinking both of disaster preparedness and disaster recovery. Again, I'm Geoffrey Ross. I'm a director at HORNE. We're engaged in providing both technical assistance as well as third-party administration to disaster preparedness and recovery activities across the country. Today, I want to, kind of raise up a few examples that, one here in California that we're collaborating on, and also one elsewhere in the country in Alabama that I think, kind of talks about the universality of what it is that we're here to discuss today. Um, it's one of those things that you know we can't really as folks working in this field can't think enough about, quite honestly. So with that, I'm going to get started here. So, really want to take, starting with the Strategic Growth Council and their Connecting Communities initiative. The state of California has really began to proactively recognize that not all of our communities are in a position to go it alone and pursue federal resources primarily to address climate impacts and the risks that we're seeing across our state. So they've engaged with us here at HORNE to serve in a technical assistance capacity with partners of the Strategic Growth Council from around the state. And by partners, those are folks that have received funding or applied for funding for SEC programs. And really, a cornerstone of this effort has been to look at and support collaborations, including those collaborations with philanthropic and private partners. We've the Connecting Communities program launched, a year ago. It's been really primarily focused on the onset of assisting applicants or partners in pursuing the EPA's community change grants. That grant came available out of the Infrastructure Act and the Climate Reduction Act last year. It opened in November. It'll be closing here in the next few weeks. But what we've seen is that we've been able to effectively engage with 60 communities across the state in pursuit of positioning for these funds in particular, but also other funds that the federal government has that really lend themselves, and sometimes might not think about it, lend themselves to disaster preparedness and to really be able to begin to try to think about how do we position ourselves, our communities, our facilities and infrastructure in a way that deals with the impacts that we're seeing, in the community daily as a result of climate. We're really excited that the first group of cohort, awardees, we saw three of our partners get awarded that in that first group. The second cohort hasn't been fully announced, but we have 60 million that's coming into the state right now as a result of those first awards. We know that we have 250 million more worth of applications that we're waiting to kind of hear about. And we have some additional projects that are going to be coming in the last few weeks before the application window closes. But needless to say, as you guys can see with this amount of money, it's very significant. It can make a tremendous impact in the communities that they're going to be serving. And so while we've been focused on the community change grants, we're also looking at positioning for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities funds, the Reconnecting Communities, and the Rebuilding America Infrastructure and Sustainability and Equity grants. So these are funding opportunities that are also available through FEMA, through the U.S. Department of Transportation. So a lot of different, funding opportunities and agencies to work with. And all this really requires the partnership, which again, why it's so important and notable that the state through SGC has really begun to fill a gap in terms of helping position our cities, our towns, and neighborhoods to pursue these resources. And so some of you are also probably pretty aware of, post-disaster, the role that HUD and FEMA and the SBA play. In fact, the SBA has been in the news recently after the two hurricanes that they're basically out of money. And so that there's going to be additional dollars coming in. But, there's there's this work that we do post disaster that is also really an important piece that allows for us to be able to really look at the ongoing needs within communities and how to position them to address the likelihood of ongoing disasters into the future. So we have these preparedness funds on the front end, and then we also have these recovery dollars on the back end, and all of them can be positioned really to look at and to figure out what we can do in our neighborhoods and to think about what does sustainability, resiliency, mitigation for climate look like as we go forward. Um, and so, all of this takes robust planning, community engagement, and partnerships. And I know folks that are participating today, listening both and then presenting to you all, have spent a lot of time doing this work. And the reason why I raised both our work, obviously, here in California and our work in Alabama is that while it looks a little different in different places, it really is something that the commonality is that it takes a partnerships. It takes a lot of collaboration and us working together. The federal government, the state, the cities, the towns, the counties, the neighborhoods, nonprofit, philanthropic partners, to make sure that we're able to really begin to understand what it is that we need to be able to address within the communities and do it in a targeted way because I raised the fact that SBA is out of funds is that even though we're talking a lot of times we talk about large sums of money when we're doing this work, it's never enough on its own to do the work that needs to be done. And so our ability to be very targeted, to be very strategic, that comes from us working together, being collaborative, and to making sure that we're inviting folks to the table, that we're getting those um, thoughts and experiences to help frame and show what needs to be done. And a lot of this work is being done, and one of the key things that is important is it's also looking at the vulnerable populations and where unmet needs lie. And these are defined based on different funding sources or different agencies that you're working with slightly differently. But again, it's where you overlap these, that creates your opportunity to really make these investments. And so in my Alabama example here that you can see on the slide, we were looking at recovery zones post Hurricane Sally and Hurricane Zeta that hit the Mobile Bay, a couple of years back. And how do they reposition, make sure that they're in a way to move forward more resiliently and to be stronger as they come back. And so, again, we're looking at this from so many different lenses, different agencies, and you know when you're looking at them, I want to help drive home, and I know my fellow speakers today are really going to be talking about this, that it's the partnerships, and I think a lot of times we look at nonprofits and local government, and we're applying to either the state or the feds, but really we have to think about the totality of what makes our community, and so that means that we should be looking at and we see a lot of times our institutes of higher learning, sometimes our tribal partners, our foundations, these organizations, as well as our neighborhood associations and our business groups, they play really important roles in mobilizing, getting information out, identifying where gaps and needs exist for us to find the right types of investments and to target our applications in meaningful ways. To make sure that we're able to do this work as effectively as possible. And when we're doing all of this, and regardless, it's less about the particular agency or the particular funding source that we're talking about at any one moment. We're able to do a wide array of projects and to have these impacts that really are meaningful. One thing that, in the TA that we've been able to do in the last year that highlighted the urgency of this work, one of our partners up in the northern part of the state, one of our tribal partners, they spent 78 days last year without power. I want you to think in the modern world what 78 days without electricity looks like, and the types of investments it takes, and the types of partnerships that it actually takes to create those investments. And so when you see like these types of projects trying to be implemented, there's a lot of different ways you can go about pursuing this work. There's a lot of different funding sources to actually try to accomplish it. But ultimately, the only way to really do it is to think about the partners and the folks in the community, and how to make sure that these efforts really target at them. So I, again, looking forward to the deeper conversation that we're going to have. My goal was to kind of like lay out some of the context here for our fellow speakers. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Lisa, and I'm going to stop sharing. So Lisa, you can.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And it's interesting. I've had some really incredible conversations with Jeff, and he's really been there on the front lines immediately after, and then also in the rebuilding phases. So he'd be a great person to connect with. Friendly reminder to work to use the Q&A and chat functions if you would like to share your questions and comments. And Lisa, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bernadette. Let me get my screen up here. And I assume you can all see that.
Looks great.
Okay, I'll move forward. I'm going to try and get through a number of slides. I think in some respects, the photos tell the full story when it really comes down to it. Just as we heard previously, partnerships are critical. Understanding your community and its particular needs and values are important. We always start with the basics, and that is people first, property next, and really getting back to those types of life structures that we need to function as a community. So as Bernadette mentioned, I've been working in this field for a number of years now. Let me see if I can get to advance there. And I too have worked around the country, from Nantucket to Annapolis to St. Augustine, from Florida to Oregon to Hawaii. So I've seen just about every type of disaster and have worked with communities, typically local governments, but obviously the stakeholders are those nonprofit organizations, those neighborhood associations, those individuals who are involved with natural resources, tribal entities. It's across the board, and it's what FEMA calls the whole community. So we really try to engage with business and civic stakeholders, and we focus on primarily the adaptation versus the mitigation side. But as you'll see in my last slides, I'm now kind of looking at adaptation for mitigation as a solution in my own community. So these are a couple of the things I'll be talking about. While I have a lot of examples, if you go to my website, you'll be able to see those around the country of planning efforts and adaptation strategies that our firm has worked with. These are a few I'm going to talk about in California because I think they represent smaller steps, many of them on the policy front. But this is kind of just an overview of disaster resilience and recovery opportunities in our state. And why is it so important? These billion-dollar events are happening more frequently, becoming more costly. This past year, or up to 2024, where we are now into November, we haven't had a billion-dollar disaster yet. Not that we haven't had million-dollar disasters with the wildfires that have gone on, certainly, but they're happening around the country. They are increasing on an exceptionally critical pace, and we're just not keeping up with it. So in California alone, you can see from NOAA's data here that behind Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, California is next in terms of the most costly disasters, between 100 and 200 billion dollars, with 46 events having occurred since about the mid 80s. These are significant, again, billion-dollar events. It doesn't account those million-dollar events or those that have wreaked havoc on just some localized areas. Matter of fact, I think we all remember 22, 23, the atmospheric rivers. Some data here demonstrates record levels of inundation in Oakland and San Francisco and Stockton, very near my hometown of Lodi. And just this past year, this is what we're looking at in terms of the largest wildfires, Park having been one this year, but these are the largest wildfires and the amount of land that or the cost is consumed for these areas. So again, significant. I'm in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. You can kind of see right there all of the waterways. We have marshlands, we have infill, we are surrounded by levees. I currently actually now have just recently joined the Sacramento San Joaquin National Heritage Area, the state's first heritage area and only heritage area, and actually be going to a meeting this afternoon and getting an update on what is happening with the management plan, which itself, as it states here, includes climate change as a significant impact on our delta, a threat to our natural and our cultural resources. So that's something that I think we have to be mindful of, that many of the planning documents and management plans coming out now contain climate change as an impactor, as an economic impactor on our communities, as well as one that can certainly change our agriculture, our social connections, and create challenges and threats for our community individuals. As a matter of fact, today I opened the paper and what did I see? San Joaquin County declares emergency due to risk of levee failure in the Delta. And it goes through in this article and talks about the impact to agriculture and to homes in the region. So there's not a day that can go by that I'm not going to be seeing something like this occurring over the next couple of months. Fortunately, we have Proposition 44 that is out there. And I think it's not a misnomer in terms of its name, but I love the fact that it is really the climate bond. We're looking at this. We ended up CivicWell sent a publication or a posting out just this morning about all the details and the opportunity it presents. So I encourage you all to take a look at that, because we'll need to be prepared and ready when, fingers crossed, that funding becomes available. But to just give you some example, that by the dollars, we're looking at billions being available for water and flood projects, wildfire and extreme heat, dealing with our natural lands and parks and wildlife, our coastal properties, and importantly for the mitigation side, clean energy projects, and important for our Central Valley in particular, agricultural projects. But I want to start with the fact that we can't get that funding until we incorporate into our planning documents the particular critical facilities that are impacted, the communities that are impacted, the resources that those communities value, and the local economy. What are the economic impacts if we don't do something? It all starts with something called the National Response Framework. Every Office of Emergency Services, anybody who is working in those areas know that they must have an emergency plan. They must put together response and recovery plans, debris management plans in the case of an emergency. Every 5 years, each jurisdiction that wants funding after a federally declared disaster must have a hazard mitigation plan in place. I would highly recommend, if you are not part of that, either county or municipal hazard mitigation planning process, you get involved, because that's where they identify the critical needs to address issues both pre-disaster as you're planning for greater resilience, and post-disaster as you're recovering from the impacts of a flooding, fire, earthquake, even extreme heat disasters. So two examples I've got here, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. It's called out in the climate bond as if you want to apply for funding, your strategy, plan, activity, adaptation action, mitigation action must align with the floodplain management strategy that is in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, for example. Same thing in resilience. The California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan is called out as necessary in terms of compliance before you can have a project you can apply for a grant for. So these are all the various types of planning documents that are at either the state or the county and local level, that getting your resources, your organization's efforts in disaster resilience into those plans is critical, because if you're integrated into those plans, you can qualify and be ready for funding as it is made available to you. I'm going to do a couple of case studies to give you some ideas of problems and solutions. Sometimes the solution is a smaller one, and sometimes, as in the Oroville Dam, it can cost billions. So I think many of us may remember the 2017 event where we had significant concerns because of atmospheric rivers, one on top of another, that we were going to see the Oroville Dam perhaps break and flood hundreds of thousands of people downstream. There was a significant erosion of the foundation and the adjacent ground next to the spillway. You can see what was happening. At that time, I was living on the East Coast, and we were seeing news reports, and I was concerned for my family. But it resulted in overtopping the atmospheric rivers. It was less than 4% of the design capacity, but no one anticipated the amount and the extreme level of precipitation. Just could not be handled by the infrastructure as was designed back in the 1960s. So there was a fear of the spillways failing, downstream flooding. The service spillway gates completely opened. They evacuated 188,000 people and had 23,000 National Guardsmen on standby. Fortunately, and you can see the post-disaster look of the spillway, they were able to address the issue, but it was really close. And I think that points to the fact that in a study that was done through Scripps later on, that these atmospheric rivers are becoming more and more potent and damaging, and really are influenced this type of disaster by global warming, in this case, a very real and recent and impactful event. This is what it looks like now. And yes, it was poor, faulty infrastructure, lack of monitoring, a number of things that now the solution, after a $1.1 billion investment by the state, led to something very important. The fact that there is now actually, believe it or not in place before, but a dam safety planning division in Cal OES. It's got a dam safety program for these extremely high hazard, impactful events on these significant resources. They're looking at doing comprehensive needs assessment for all of the dams. And then they have now put in place proactive monitoring, taking into account climate impacts. And I think that is critical, and admitting the fact that climate is playing a huge difference. Another simple one in the community, the Delta Island community of Islandton. Um, Many of you may or may not know, I do a whole presentation on flood insurance, but in this particular community, the problem was that you're looking at communities in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta area that have a chance of flooding once every 10 years. That's significant. And yet, only a third to a fifth of the individuals that live in those properties have flood insurance because they have very high rates of poverty. Some of them have owned those properties for years. Their mortgage doesn't require them, or their past mortgage didn't require them to have flood insurance. But the National Flood Insurance Program does not pay for temporary housing. Things to know. I would encourage you all to research NFIP to see what it does and doesn't pay for it. A lot of misconceptions. So what did they do? They created a special district. They have a Delta Region Geological Hazard Abatement District. They then developed this concept of what they call parametric insurance. This is funded by the community, the area. It's no strings attached payout. It helps with immediate costs. I've got to have somewhere to live short term. I need, a couple $1,000s. Where do I go to get it? I don't have the resources. It requires voter approval. And so they needed to make a real case about the importance of protecting these individuals and all of those by saying, let's get ahead of this. Kathleen Schaefer, who's a UC Davis doctoral candidate, did this research, and she's right, the levees will eventually fail. And so it's about protecting families if the levee dies, just as you would with your own life insurance. So, an important program. I'm going to jump to wildfire. In this instance, I mentioned the August or the 10 top fires. The August complex fire was one of the most significant, affecting a number of counties. You can do adaptation measures ahead of time. Forest Service does this all the time. I mean, I think the first time I saw them wrap a giant sequoia, I was amazed. But it does help with protecting those in a temporary manner. So just so you know what can be done on a wrap on a temporary basis. But I want to talk about the wildfire mitigation and an example of Nevada City in a very high fire hazard severity zone, over 3,000 residents in this area. I show these two pictures. These are the firehouses, the historic firehouses in Nevada City. So I found it rather appropriate. We're talking about fire, and there's two historic firehouses there in the city. But what they did was through regulatory controls, there's always the carrot and the stick. This is a stick. In 2023, they put in place an ordinance that required hardening for homes within that high hazard area. And so you'll see this, many of you looking across the user group here and how many have joined us. Defensible space is one of the first tools you can use to keep away what would be necessarily fuels for fire away from homes and businesses and urbanized areas. It gives you a list within that ordinance of the priorities for remodeling or for new construction, where you start first, roof being the most important, and then from there on down. But the other thing that they addressed in their mitigation was a strong focus on nature-based strategies. There you can see a view of Nevada City. So I think we can all understand why it's highly susceptible to fire. We heard about partnerships earlier. They have a partnership with the irrigation district, the OES, the Nisenan tribe. They're looking to defend about 433 acres, and it was funded by the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. So there are nonprofit organizations that are putting funding out there. What I love about this program is the fact, as I said earlier, the tribes are very much involved. And I encourage you to research their story, because this was really about the traditional practices, traditional land practices of tribal communities being taught and retaught to young people. Really, the cultural fires themselves are land stewardship lessons, and they're cultural lessons that we're getting back as Native people. And I think that's so important to understand those cultural ties to, let's start with the Native practices. They have hundreds of years of knowledge and experience that can come to play. I'm going to kind of close with a project going on in outside of my own community of Lodi, California. This is the mitigation or adaptation to mitigation approach. We have an energy center in our city, a natural gas plant that is nearing the end of its useful life. We have been working with Siemens and other specialists in hydrogen to develop a clean energy hydrogen powered facility. There are hundreds of natural gas plants around the country. This is a model that we've been successful in working with regional partners, the Northern California Power Agency, to get funding from the Biden administration to support the transition. And so there is the plant. It will transition through those through a process of electrolysis through these hydrolyzers, and there are going to be significant benefits, both in terms of net zero solutions for reuse of a facility, job creation, obvious health benefits, and alternative fueling stations for transit, rail, and long-haul commercial vehicles. So these are opportunities that even small communities, where almost just under 70,000 people, have the opportunity to benefit from. And I'm going to close with two sources of funding that I think everyone needs to be aware of. We heard earlier a little bit about that, and I'm glad to hear we're going to hear about funding opportunities in the next webinar. But I highly recommend people check out the Building Resilient Infrastructure, the BRIC program. It has the largest amount of money available that can be used by communities, whether it's passed through your state and county, or working with your nonprofit organizations. SBA, again, some of these are loans in post-event, but also they can help with mitigation planning ahead of time. The Department of Interior has a Tribal Climate Resilience Grant Program. EPA has funding, so a number of federal opportunities are available. And then in our own state of California, we have post-disaster funding through a number of sources. We have pre-disaster funding, which I've identified here. I underscore every single time I present hazard mitigation grant program, because that creates a great opportunity. In my work in Annapolis, Maryland, we got about $170,000 to develop a cultural resource-based annex to our city's hazard mitigation program. I encourage you to look at that. And the last one is this document, Proposed Funding Pathways for Adaptation to Climate Change in California. This is a great resource that can provide information on local funding sources and financial tools for adaptation related to climate, environmental, and other kinds of natural disasters. So I close with that, and I will stop my share.
Yeah, thank you so
and
much.
Turn it back to you all.
There's definitely been a wealth of information that you have received and will receive. So I'll just note a couple things. These slides will be available after this webinar, as well as a video recording for you to review or share with your colleagues. And I'll just note too, look at the chat and the Q&A. I'll note, for example, someone asked if there is any rapid funding available for long-term disaster recovery, and Jeff responded, just to be clear, often long-term recovery is not actually that rapid. It can take 18 to 24 months. When we talk about planning, it's really important, as well as really planning at that local level. And from that, we've heard a lot of national and statewide perspectives. And I would like to pivot to my colleague, Kirin, to talk a little bit about some of the philanthropic and public funding opportunities that he's been working with. So Kirin, turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bernadette. Good to be on this webinar with you all. I'm going to try to fly through some of these remarks because I want to get to some of the questions that you all have for us. Just by way of background, I'm I always mess this up, the Director for Climate and Disaster Resilience. It's all these long titles at Northern California Grantmakers. We at Northern California Grantmakers are not, it's a funny title, are not grant makers ourselves. We are what's called a philanthropy serving organization. We like to consider ourselves a philanthropy transforming organization. We work with the sector to better guide the resources that philanthropy is making available to communities and initiatives in a way that is forward-thinking, focused on upstream interventions and rooted in racial equity. So I have the pleasure and the privilege of having kind of a global perspective on kind of where philanthropy can be active in these spaces, particularly in this kind of journey from disaster into resilience. We know in California, natural hazards really test the resilience of communities, and they worsen already dramatic disparities around wealth and power along economic and racial lines. The reality is that less than 5% of philanthropic dollars go towards reducing hazard risks and preparing our communities for disaster. Take that a step further, only 2% of global philanthropic dollars are going towards mitigation. Even further, even less of that is going towards resilience. So there's a lot of work to be done to move the sector of philanthropy around specifically disaster mitigation and resilience. And we know that's unsustainable. From reports and studies that have been done on this, we know that where every $1 spent on mitigation, we're saving $6 in long-term costs. So set that one aside. we also find ourselves in a moment nationally where there's close to $2 trillion available across federal, state levels to invest in multi-benefit climate resilience and community development projects that are not only conveying climate risk benefits, but really are enabling a just transition at an economy-wide scale. Okay, take those two pieces together. We know that there's serious challenges facing communities to get shovel-worthy projects to shovel-ready and attracting further private investment to help projects pencil. So for us, a critical aspect in the work of organizing philanthropy is really deepening the sector's involvement around enabling an investable pipeline of projects in communities and de-risking projects in communities that have struggled to access investment. I will just share with folks a relatively sobering report by, oops, it's a bullet point, Union of Concerned Scientists, kind of remarking on where we are with the spend down of just as $40 and the needs there. We really anchor all of our work in kind of that call to action. For time, I'm going to kind of quickly run through what we are doing as a philanthropy serving organization, just to say we have an active role in response where we actually vet and host and lift up funds that are activated during disasters for very specific response functions and driving dollars to community. That being said, we're really trying to use that response function and the experience we have working directly with frontline communities to move funders upstream. And so we host a Climate and Disaster Resilience Funders Group, which is an educational opportunity for folks to hear directly from communities like yourselves around what it looks like to be active in disaster and to respond and try to move your community out of that cycle of perpetual response into resilience. So we're lifting up those opportunities, but ultimately where the work is most rewarding is organizing the sector. This next year, we're going to be launching a new public funding work group with our funders with the goal of really organizing the sector around kind of 3 persistent issues that are coming up in terms of accessing public funding. So the first pillar being capacity building, project development, project pre-development. The second pillar being working capital, everything from upfront dollars as we wait for reimbursable grants to buying down the cost of expensive DOE loans that are available right now. And then the third issue area that we really want to organize folks around are community benefits. They're massive publicly subsidized projects that are coming down the pike in California, and we really need to identify sustainable, accessible funding for communities to engage in a much more meaningful, proactive conversation around community benefits. So that's some of the work that we are trying to launch around moving the sector to be a much better partner to community in this kind of equation around disaster and climate resilience. I wanted to end with a couple of bright spots that we're tracking. So the first is the Community Economic Mobilization Initiative, or CEMI. This is a partnership or it's a pooled funding opportunity from the Sierra Health Foundation that's really focused on capacity building around Justice 40. I truly encourage folks to connect with CEMI partners that have already been funded, as they are capacitated right now to be thinking and supporting cross-sector partnerships in this space. The next is the Klamath River Fund, which is led by the Humboldt Area Fund or Foundation and Wild Rivers Foundation, really set up following the largest dam removal in the nation's history. It's a 10-year initiative meant to advance climate and community resilience within the Klamath River the Klamath River watershed to increase philanthropic and public funding for tribal and rural community needs in the basin. And then finally, I wanted to share about, so I'm pulling up all these links, is the Thriving Communities Social and Environmental Entrepreneurs, or SEE initiative that's being led by Resources Legacy Fund, Liberty Hill Foundation in LA, and Native Americans in Philanthropy, as well as a couple of other philanthropic partners. This is an initiative that's a federal EPA regranting effort that's being led by philanthropy, really to invest again in that capacity issue that communities are facing to advance environmental justice, including upstream investments into the climate planning mitigation work that we're talking about. All right, my key takeaway for everybody, back to what Jeff led us off with, is partnership. So I think the most impactful thing that folks can do on this webinar right now, in the next 6 hours that we've got remaining in the day, reach out to your local community foundation and place-based funder. These are organizations that are often on the front lines of disaster response, but are critically aware of the need to move resources upstream. So it's only through these kinds of partnerships and collaboration across sector that we're going to be able to scale philanthropic investment, really in the kind of building blocks of resilience. I'll stop there, pass it over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kirin. All of these individuals have worked deeply in their local communities. So I just want to take a moment to just really recognize there's been some folks who are sharing in the comments and in the Q&A that, you know, when you are actively healing your community, you are probably also working on your home, your business, your children's schools. So we are often on the front lines in more than one way as individuals and also as residents. So I wanted to turn it over to Sarah to talk about some of the work that she's doing in the Bay Area.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Really glad to be here and see everyone's presentations. I am Sarah Atkinson. I'm the Hazard Resilience Senior Policy Manager at SPUR. We're a nonprofit urban policy and planning organization based in San Francisco, but we work across the Bay Area. And doesn't want to change slides. Our mission is through research, education, and advocacy, we work to create an equitable, sustainable, and prosperous region in which all people thrive. And we do this at the intersection of housing, transportation, planning, good governance, and sustainability and resilience. And obviously my policy area is sustainability and resilience, focusing more on the resilience aspect. And our platform is that the region should be environmentally just, carbon neutral, and resilient to climate change and earthquakes. So I'm focused on earthquake resilience, but then for climate change, specifically on sea level rise and flood resilience. SPUR has worked on hazard resilience for a very long time. In like 2010, we worked on a big initiative called the Resilient City Initiative, which was focused actually on earthquake resilience, but has a lot of takeaways for climate resilience and adaptation that we are looking at now. And in March 2020, we released a report called Safety First, Improving Hazard Resilience in the Bay Area, where we provide a number of recommendations around, you know, how the Bay Area needs to move forward in the face of sea level rise, earthquake hazards, wildfire hazards. So I want to bring us back to kind of the initial question of the webinar. How can local communities make the most of state and federal funding to prepare for and respond to extreme weather events? So I'm going to talk through some projects that I've gotten to work on. So first, making the most of this funding, regional collaboration and prioritization is really critical. And I've gotten to take part in the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan development. This is a project that the Bay Conservation and Development Commission moved forward over the last year, and SPUR was on the advisory group, along with a number of local government leaders and staff members, consultants, other advocacy organizations like SPUR, community-based organizations. It was a really big group. We developed a One Bay vision of how we wanted the region to move forward on shoreline resilience, what our main goals were, and then also what were some key actions. And this guidance is going to inform local shoreline resilience plans, which after SB 272 are now required to be turned into BCDC by 2034. And we're really hoping to see those plans move forward more quickly than that. There is state funding for these plans, SB 1, and those are right now going towards the planning part, but in the future, they will go towards actual implementation projects that come from these plans. So regional guidance is really important, regional coordination is important, and then also BCDC is trying to figure out how to prioritize projects of like, where is money most needed right now, and how to make sure higher resource jurisdictions that are already kind of farther along in their sea level rise planning aren't getting all of the funding, and that there's more of an equitable distribution of funding. Prioritize vulnerable communities. That this is a really key part of getting funding and also making the most use of funding from the state and federal level. This year, I got to work with a community-based organization, Nuestra Casa, based in East Palo Alto. We produced a report together called Look Out Below that looks at groundwater rise impacts on East Palo Alto, but also looked more holistically at combined coastal flood risk in East Palo Alto and what the issues are going to be and what the issues are today. And what has come from this is SPUR has been able to provide support for a coalition to develop called the Peninsula Accountability for Contamination team, PACT. And this coalition is really thinking about how to address the issue of contaminated sites that are at risk of sea level rise and flooding, because that was one of the issues that came up for the community in doing this research. Was they're really concerned about how these contaminated sites are going to continue to impact public health. Obviously focusing on reducing risk and hazard exposure, I'll highlight the Burlingame Sea Level Rise Overlay District, which I believe was adopted in 2021. This is an overlay on a commercial district, and it has design requirements for new developments. And this is in the future going to hopefully reduce risk in this area, reduce the amount of money that is going to be needed to recover in this area for new developments if there is sea level rise flooding. And we need more things like this. And so I also wanted to highlight the Oakland Wildfire Prevention Zone. There is a Measure MM on the ballot this year to pass a special district parcel tax to get funding for wildfire mitigation. SPUR does a voter guide every year, and we look at statewide propositions, but also measures in Oakland, San Francisco, and San Jose. And so I was able to do some research, and we are advocating for people to vote yes on this. Incentivizing retrofits. I'm going to skip through this, but we have a lot of existing buildings that need to be retrofitted. The SFPUC has a floodwater grant program to incentivize these retrofits and provide funding for them. And we are also working with the SFPUC on some new building code requirements for new developments in the flood district. And I'll just close. Lisa mentioned Prop 4. We have been doing a lot of advocacy at SPUR around Prop 4, and this is really sorely needed. A lot of this funding was actually cut from the budget this year, and this is just putting that money back. And yeah, besides this, we also need just more advocacy efforts at the state and federal level for hazard mitigation. We need more funding, and we have a lot of things to cover. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for those who are able to stay on, we'll continue to take questions until 5 after, so 12:05. We know this was drinking from a fire hose, so I'll just reiterate that the landing page on our website will have a recording of this video, as well as the incredible amount of resources that are being provided both by our speakers and by attendees in the chat. So I wanted to highlight a couple takeaways that I'm hearing. We hear how critical it is to have a plan. Do your plan now, get the resource. There are quite a few resources to help with planning. Recovery resources do not move quickly. So just be prepared. There isn't a superhero or a magic bucket of funding that is going to become immediately available. And this recovery takes a very long time. Planning at a local level is also very critical. So a lot of resources around that. And I also really like this emphasis too around developing and supporting these mutual networks. The last thing I'll highlight is that there needs to be support for Prop 4 on the ballot next Tuesday. So you can do early voting and mail in now. And also exploring future resources as they come available. So I just wanted to see, first of all, if our speakers, and maybe I'll turn to you, Sarah, first, and if anyone else would like to chime in, we'd like to hear. There was a question in the chat that has been addressed, but I just wanted to highlight, one of the participants, one of our attendees said that they were recently in Asheville, North Carolina, post Hurricane Helene, and they noted that the most important activity that those residents mentioned that helped them survive and thrive were the mutual aid efforts. We are relying on our peers and our neighbors. And so the question is, how can we ensure that these smaller mutual aid efforts and also these decentralized networks are uplifted and funded? So Sarah, if you have any insights on that, and if any of the other attendees would like to join, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. It can be really difficult for these smaller mutual aid groups to access state and federal funding. So partnerships with the local government and really local government reaching out to those groups and creating the partnerships. It can be difficult from the other direction for many reasons. Sometimes it's mistrust. Sometimes it's just not feeling, not knowing that there's funding available. But this is definitely mutual aid efforts in East Palo Alto have been very important during the floods that happened in winter of 2023. People supported each other in actually community organizations had sandbags. People could go pick up sandbags, and that was in partnership with the city. And then also in areas that did flood, people were helping each other move their cars and get their stuff out of the way. So it's definitely really important to support these mutual aid groups.
Yeah, thanks for that. Lisa, you're a community leader and someone who consults. You probably have some good ideas.
Yeah, one of the tools that we advocate for every time we're doing a plan, and again, it comes back to don't let all those people go that were stakeholders in your planning effort. They all have the ability to continue to contribute. So keep them together, as as a team. Maybe every 6 months you're updating your, hazard mitigation plan progress. What have you guys been seeing? What are your individual organizations themselves doing? But one of the things we put in play is what we call a triage team. So in essence, what do we need in a recovery, immediate, rapid recovery situation? We need architects, contractors, we need building officials who can do very quick reviews. We need streamlining of review processes in the field so people don't have to get a permit for something. We need public health individuals who come to explain that don't walk around in the floodwaters, that they can be toxic. We need recovery firms who specialize in recovery post-disaster and know how to advise residents on the proper way to dispose of materials. So ahead of time, put together a triage team, have that list available. FEMA is looking for that kind of local support because the thing I have to always stress is it all starts locally. They are looking to your local leadership. And those are the individuals that need to take the training. I just went through OES training this past week. Get trained, understand what your role is in recovery, and then stick in your lane when it comes to recovery. So.
Yeah, really good insights. And Jeff and Kirin, both of you have worked with some of these community groups in other co-benefit areas like health, housing, and transportation. So I wanted to see if you wanted to weigh in on that question about mutual aid, but also there's work now. So we don't have to wait for the disaster. There's opportunities to be advocating for better planned, better designed communities and supporting CBO. So Jeff, and then I think Kirin, you get to take us home with the final remarks.
Yeah, I would just say funding's hard, right? So I tried to respond that you can sometimes get short-term funding. The Community Change Grant allowed for some of that, and it helps build models, things like that. But it really comes down to, and I hear even in some of our responses, and it was brought up a bit, it's about trust building. You've got to create these authentic relationships where folks can ask hard questions, know that it's a space where they're going to get answers on how to prepare and to do things, and what's possible, what's not possible, why is that the case, right? So that's why these conversations and bringing everyone to the table, because it's hard to do disaster preparedness or recovery if not everyone's been involved. To Lisa's point, planning. If you're not planning for everyone, you're failing to plan. And so, these are really important pieces. Sarah brought up the point of, you actually don't get any of this funding really if you're not identifying vulnerable communities and populations and stuff like that. So if they're not at the table, you're not going to be competitive. There's so many nuances to these pieces. So I would say that the first and most important step that leads to everything else is trust building. And so you've got to begin doing that work. And the sooner you start to do that, the better your community is going to be, regardless of when disaster is going to strike. Because let's be honest, if you look at a disaster map of the country, there's not a place really in the country where disaster is not likely to occur. So you've got to begin those conversations. You got to start doing that work. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kirin so he can drive us home.
I don't know that I can beat that. Just to say that the building blocks, the glue to resilience is trust and relationships. And when those trust and relationships have been established, they lead to long-term benefits of being able to respond effectively during disaster, and should be cultivated, maintained to support long-term planning that moves folks out of these persistent cycles of response into long-term resilience with a focus on historically marginalized communities.
That's excellent. I'm just thrilled to have all of you speak. You all come from really rich backgrounds on this particular topic. I'll just highlight that one of our attendees from the California Department of Public Health noted that on November 7th, there's going to be a meeting of the CDPH Climate Action Team. And so we'll make that information available. So please track your emails. We'll provide information as we've collected it. Make sure that you go out and vote, and happy Halloween, everybody.
Happy Halloween.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Y'all later.